Again, let's get started. So if you remember when I did the overview, sort of this like really broad definition of regulation, and then we split into three umbrellas: antitrust, then we split that into sort of merger control / exclusionary conduct. Talked about some basic theoretical trade-offs. Talked about collusion, and that was sort of my starting point, the Green-Porter model for thinking about collusion. And Alon and John filled that in with a bunch of nice empirical papers. So you can, we just went over all those. So we're going to move to this zone of regulation now. A little bit more time here at the beginning, but we're gonna get there, and they often intersect. Okay, so you remember we talked about the Baron-Meyerson optimal mechanism for regulating a firm under adverse selection. Okay, and we talked about this time consistency issue where you want firms to make big sunk investments, but when they're subject to future regulation that's uncertain, they might be wary of making those investments. So we're going to split this. Before lunch, we're going to talk about static models, sort of either no investment or sort of two-period models. We're going to look at an early paper by Frank Wolak in water utilities. And then we're going to look at a very more recent paper by Mike Abito on electricity generation. That's going to have both economic and environmental regulation in it. We'll look at this paper in the AER by Gampin, Ivaldi, and Martimor on commitment by regulators for bus transportation in France. And then I'll talk about a paper I wrote about regulating prices for generic pharmaceuticals. Okay, so just some high-level comments before I jump in. There's going to be, so in these papers and then the session after lunch, there's going to be a lot of common themes. There's going to be a few common themes that come in and out of different papers. So like each paper will have a subset of these themes. And that'll be nice to see how that crosses many different sectors and settings and locations. This literature is frustrating to dig into because each paper is about a different market, whether it's water, electricity, transportation. They all have, in different countries, different states, highly specialized regulatory institutions that you're trying to interpret and need to understand the details, different production technologies. We'll look at two different water papers. We'll look at Wolak, then we'll look at a paper by Timmons. And even there, the details are in the same state, California. Okay, but even there, the details are different because they're different municipalities in California. Okay, so it's a bit of a struggle to get through all these. I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, and my goal is I'm going to, for each paper, give you the players, the payoff functions, the equilibrium concept, and then sort of the empirical results. I'm not going to focus too much on the estimation details. Okay, those are super important for doing this stuff. It's just in this forum with the amount of time we have and audience, I don't think it's the best use of our time. So we're going to do a little bit more breadth than depth on the individual estimations. Okay, so this Wolak paper, it's an early paper in the sense that it was estimating a model of asymmetric information, early 90s, early mid-90s. The setting, like I said, is water utilities in California. The empirical literature up to the time for estimating cost functions or production functions of regulated utilities focused on the assumption of no asymmetric information. Okay, so they didn't really take into account that these firms were being regulated and there might be asymmetric information that affects their behavior. They interpreted their output through the lens of a model with no asymmetric information. So, that a famous paper like that is Christensen and Green for electricity generation. Okay, so Wolak comes along and he says, all right, I'm going to estimate both models. I'll estimate a complete information, symmetric information model. I'll estimate an asymmetric information model and try to test between the two. He's going to test between the two, find evidence for the asymmetric information model, and then sort of explore the implications of that. Like what would happen if there was no asymmetric information. Okay, so we're going to look at Wolak, then we're going to look at a paper by his student after lunch, Chris Timmons. They're both about water utilities in California. Here, the water utilities are privately owned companies. Okay, in the Timmons paper, they're going to be owned by the government. There's going to be some cities who run their own water utility. Okay, here they're private firms. They are regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. Okay, so that there's a governmental body who's going to run rate cases and say, okay, you can charge this much for water to these different classes of customers. So the water utilities, they do a bunch of things. They take water from some source, whether it's from the ground or from reserves or reservoirs. They treat the water to make it drinkable, potable, and they pipe it out to customers. The inputs, the production technologies, you need some water source. Okay, they maintain and invest in all the capital, mostly a bunch of pipes, labor, okay, and then electricity to pump the water around. Okay, so he's going to specify a production function. This is going to be an objective estimation. Okay, we're going to estimate this under two different models, the private information model and the symmetric information model. Okay, so there's capital, labor, and he's going to put the asymmetric information in the labor part of the model. This is a modeling decision, which we'll talk about. So that star there that's indicating that there's something different between the actual amount of labor being used and what the regulator thinks is being used. Electricity, and then some idiosyncratic shock. Okay, and we want to estimate these parameters. Beta, these are things like economies of scale for producing water. Okay. The betas are going to be assumed to be known to both the regulator, so they're unknown to the econometrician. We're trying to estimate them. We're going to assume the regulator and the firm know those. Okay, so that's not what the asymmetric information is about. It's about something about what the regulator perceives is the labor efficiency of the firm. Okay, and that's just an idiosyncratic cost shock. Okay, so the formulation is going to distinguish between two labor variables. There's going to be an Li, so for utility I, without a star and with a star. Okay, and they're related through a productivity parameter. It's the same notation as Barron and Meyerson. Okay, the theta I, that's the efficiency parameter known privately to the firm. Okay, so the Li star is the actual sort of effective quantity of labor chosen, okay, which is going to depend on Li. That's how much is reported to the regulator. That's what the regulator sees in the cost function. So this is the function that generates the observed cost to the regulator. Okay, the regulator is going to see some total operating costs for the firm. Okay, but that Li gets amplified by theta. So d is some increasing function of the underlying efficiency of the firm. Okay, so slightly different than Barron-Meyerson. It's reminiscent. Okay, you remember Barron-Meyerson was sort of moving it was a simpler cost structure. Okay, there wasn't labor and capital. Okay, but it's a similar type of idea. Okay, it's an adverse selection model in particular. There's no moral hazard. Okay, so this theta is fixed. There's no efforts being made. We're going to look at papers with moral hazard as well. Okay, but it's an adverse selection model. The friction is that the firm knows theta and the regulator doesn't. Okay, so he's going to derive the optimal regulatory contract. Remember, I showed you the full information optimal mechanism where you just pay the marginal cost, price at marginal cost, and then pay the fixed cost. Okay, then there's the asymmetric. Yes, please.
So just one clarification. In the previous slide, if theta I will increase, then Li star should decrease or decrease?
So d is increasing. So theta I going up makes the whole thing lower.
Lower.
Yep.
So, but then you said that Li star is the effective one, right? So if productivity is increasing, then my effective labor should go down.
Yeah, let me make sure I got the signs right here. So Li is what the regulator sees. Right. That's true. Okay, so if I have a high theta, that's going to, so this is how much labor I actually have to pay. So the difference between these two is what I pocket. Okay? So I report a high Li, but I only had to use less because I'm really efficient.
No. No.
Okay. Okay, so he's gonna rely really heavily on the theoretical implications of optimal mechanism design. Okay, so he's going to derive the full optimal mechanism. It's not too different than Barron and Meyerson, and we're gonna mostly keep the notation and from Barron and Meyerson. And remember there, you can't let them just report costs because then they're going to want to say they have a really high cost. But you got to give them some benefit for saying they have a low cost. Okay, and that comes through that fixed subsidy that you pay to them. Okay, so let's remember what that was. This is not the exact same setup as Wolak. Okay, but this is just repeating the slides from the Barron and Meyerson. Okay, so under full information, if you know theta, you would just pay them. You'd set the price at marginal cost. Okay. pay them the fixed cost to operate if it's worthwhile to operate. Okay. Here, under the asymmetric information, you don't pay theta, you pay this function z of theta, okay, which is non-decreasing in theta, okay, but it's not, the slope isn't 1. Okay, and if you report a higher cost, okay, so your z is higher, you pay for it on the subsidy. Okay, so those are incentives not to misreport. That's chosen just right so you don't misreport, okay, in a way that's advantageous for the regulator. Okay, and the main empirical difference between these two is that it leads to different pass-throughs of costs to prices. Okay, so the way he's going to distinguish between this model and that model is he's going to have something in the data that shocks costs. He's going to look at how that passes through to prices, and that pass-through is going to be more consistent with the private information model. Okay, but this is, I mean, you take a step back and think about what's going on. This is like a very strong interpretation of what's happening in the regulatory process. Okay, the regulatory process is there's this public utility commission, a bunch of bureaucrats, firms with their own interests, consumer advocates. They go through a rate case, like a several-month ordeal, testimony, blah, blah, blah. You come out with this rate document, okay, that's very complicated. And he's going to say all of that is summarized by this. Okay, and he's going to use these to interpret the data. Okay, so it's taking a pretty strong stand on what's going on in reality. Yes?
Is it possible for the government to have a contract with another firm or to replace the firm?
So they could replace the firm. Okay, so they could fire them, and they control the rights to build pipes on their public land at the end of the day, and that happens, though rarely. But they wouldn't have two firms at once, because the whole point is it's a natural monopoly. So you want to let one firm do it. You don't want duplication. Okay. Okay, so the empirical work, which we're going to go through a bit, is it's going to assume some functional form for the production function and the stochastic disturbances. Okay, we'll specify those. And then it's going to estimate the full information and private information model. That's by maximum likelihood. There's a lot of details. Okay, fairly involved because of the private information. We're not going to get into the details of that. Okay, the analysis is going to suggest the private information fits the data better, and we'll look at the differences in some of the estimates, and then so that's basically going to select the private information model. Then the counterfactual he's interested in is, okay, what if there were no private information? How big are the losses from having, how far away from the first best are we because of private information? Okay, which is a little bit more of a theoretical benchmark. Okay, we're not sort of thinking about what could we do to reduce the information asymmetries. Okay, but it gives you a sense of like how important is this stuff. If you put in the literature, like there is all this theoretical work about optimal regulation, and there's a ton of papers following Barrett and Meyerson. It's like a huge literature. And he's sort of taking a step back and saying, okay, how big could this stuff be? Okay, and he's going to find, okay, in his analysis, he's going to find it's moderately large. Okay, worth thinking about. Okay, so he specifies a Cobb-Douglas production function. Okay, so you got your capital, labor, electricity, okay, a shock. Particular functional form for that D function, that's a choice. He has some justification for that. What I want you to keep in mind in all of these is that there's a lot of functional form assumptions, okay, and a lot of assumptions about how to interpret the regulatory process. One of the things that makes this literature a little hard to follow sometimes. Okay, demand is going to be pretty uncontroversial. There's some choke price above which people won't pay, okay, and then you have this function of demographics and how big the city is and so on. He's looking across different cities. Okay, so from these primitives, yes.
How important is this assumption? Because it's quite strange that people will buy zero water. Like how?
Yeah, I mean you can make this as large as you like, right? So at $1 trillion, you're going to buy zero water. So I don't think that's.
Okay.
There's probably some technical reason in it.
Because it's also in there. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.
You don't have to dwell on it. just wondering, this issue of the private cost, why is it so difficult for the regulator to ask for documentation of costs?
Oh, they do. They ask for lots of documentation. They even send teams there to investigate the premises. They have testimony. But it doesn't, I mean, the sense is that it doesn't reveal everything.
Why not?
Because
Why not?
the world is complicated. Life is complicated.
You don't-
The whole, it's a huge production.
Everything is documented, right? Every payment they make has to be documented. They should reveal everything.
It's like how smart and hardworking are your pipe maintenance people? You know, how much
I
could,
don't care about that. I just care about how much I pay them.
You have to separate fixed costs from.
no, it's the theta is the underlying real productivity.
From the receipts.
Theta is like if you could operate the firm efficiently, what would the cost be? What you see is the costs that are operated under regulation. So you can't infer it just from the reported costs that they write down the costs because they're optimizing how they allocate their labor and so on. Eric.
Yeah, also, you're abstracting away from moral hazard here. Like presumably in practice, a firm may not work as hard as a code. That's very hard to find.
Yeah, we're gonna get to papers that have both moral hazard and adverse selection. You know, I'm open to thinking that it's not perfectly knowable, the cost structure of the firm. You know, I'm willing to entertain that hypothesis. I mean, why can't an insurance company know everything about the person? They can go to the doctor and get health reports, but you know, there's other stuff as well. So we're gonna entertain that. I mean, he's entertaining the hypothesis. He's not forcing it. He's going to test it against the full information model. But if you ask me, I mean, my prior would be, yeah, there's private information, like everything else. Okay, so when you combine those parametric assumptions with the optimal mechanism that he derives, you get different variable cost functions under S models for symmetric information, A models for asymmetric information, so full private information. Okay, different cost functions reflecting that sort of different type of pass-through for cost shocks. Okay, I don't want to interpret these directly. Okay, that's sort of the variation in the data.
Can you just tell us what H of theta is?
I looked. I don't remember. I looked it up.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, sorry. It's yeah. I guess it only depends on. Yeah, I don't.
Go ahead.
Okay, sorry about that. During the break, I'll go back and double check.
Is there any sense, is there any value of the parameter that makes the symmetric special case of the asymmetric?
They're not nested. No, they're not nested models.
No?
No. Yeah. So he's got to do non-nested tests between the two. Yeah. So estimates each separately by maximum likelihood. Okay. So the observed data are these observed costs and input costs. So you have those input costs sort of shocking the system. You're seeing how does that get passed into the regulated prices. Okay. And I just want you to get that intuition that you get more pass-through under the full information model. That's not what he sees. Okay, so he's going to reject the null of equality in favor of the asymmetric information model. Okay, it's really that's the intuition that pass-through is different. Now, in terms of the implications, so he has estimates for both models. This is the distribution of theta under each model. This is under the full information S, and this is under asymmetric information. They're sort of wildly different than each other. Okay. Now, I don't know how much I believe either of them, given sort of all the assumptions, data quality, and so on. Okay, but the point is they could potentially be very different from each other. They have very different implications. Okay, so he chooses this one, right, based on the non-nested test. And then he asks the question, okay, yes?
Theta equals 1 is something special in the model, because it seems like that's a separation. One is theta less than 1, the other is theta bigger than 1.
Yeah, I mean, there's
Theta equal 1, something special happening there in the model?
there's some normalization for the symmetric information model. There is some mass in there is actually mass in the asymmetric information model here.
No, I mean in the model, something happens at theta equals 1. I don't know.
No, it's more
the
about-
formulas are very complex.
Yeah, no, I didn't want to get into all that, but it's that, so for the S model, there is some normalization for the lower bound of theta, which he puts at 1. But the shapes are very different from each other. Okay, so you can sort of translate the distributions, but the shapes are quite different from each other. Okay, so then he asks the question, he sort of settles on that there's asymmetric information. And he says, well, what if there were not asymmetric information? Now we have the full cost function. Okay, we can say, well, how much more output could we have were information symmetric between the regulator and utility? That's sort of the main counterfactual. Okay, it's again sort of a theory. There's sort of two types of counterfactuals in my mind. There's theoretical benchmarks, things that you won't really hope to achieve, but you just want to know, it's a benchmark. Okay, and there's sort of realistic policy changes where you sort of get maybe part of the way. Okay, this is one of those benchmark ones. He finds output would be 20% higher were information symmetric between the regulator and the utility. Okay. And that's under the optimal full information regulatory contract. Okay, so it's sort of two things changing. Well, two things you got to swallow. First, that information becomes symmetric, and they implement the regulatory contract optimally. Okay, so it's an early paper. You got to give him credit for sort of being ahead of the game on this one. Sort of in a fairly obscure journal, but a lot of the ideas that show up later are already in that paper. Okay, so we're going to move to another sector, which is electricity generation. And there, a big issue is not just that there's natural monopoly, but that these firms pollute. Okay, so when they generate electricity, they're also leaving off carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, etc. And we know in simple models that how to negate that externality by taxation or equivalent schemes. But we also know that those don't necessarily hold when you're not starting from a competitive model. Okay, so I'll show you that. Okay, so Abito's paper, similar, it's going to have asymmetric information between the regulator and the firm. Firms are subject to economic regulation. He's going to be looking even though the paper was written recently, he's going to be looking in the 1980s, okay, because the electricity generation sector was largely deregulated in the US. Okay, so it used to be regulated, okay, but as technology changed, it basically became deregulated. Okay, so in the electricity world, there's people split into 3 different subsectors. There's the power plants that generate the power. Okay, there's these transmission lines, which are those are the really big transmission lines that bring long distances, high voltage. Okay, that's its own sector, transmission. And then there's the stuff you see on the streets, the distribution. Okay, so we're here right now. Okay, after lunch, we're going to look over here as well. Okay, the philosophy is quite different. I alluded to this the other day. Okay, whereas they're both going to condition on interpret regulatory behavior. Okay, but Wolak, like we talked about, is leaning really heavily on sort of optimal mechanism design. Okay, what Abito is going to say is, look, I don't think that's what they're doing. Just as a first pass is I don't see them writing checks to the utility. That doesn't happen. All they do is state the price. Okay, there's no subsidy. Okay, so that's like a refutation of the optimal mechanism. But I'm going to try to look at what they do and then say that's the behavior of the regulator. Okay, it doesn't necessarily come from anything optimal. Okay, and they're going to look at how the firm reacts to that, okay, to infer the cost parameters of the firm. And then his counterfactual is going to be the optimal mechanism under asymmetric information, okay, rather than the optimal mechanism under symmetric information. Okay, now that would already be interesting if there was no environmental regulation, but here we have this pollution issue going on. And he's also partly motivated by the fact that textbook answers to how to environmentally regulate become not obvious when you're not in a competitive environment. Okay, so this is a point made a long time ago by Buchanan. It's actually a pretty trivial point. There's a graph. So the way to think about it is, so if you're in a competitive market, you want to tax the externality, right? Micro one-on-one. And the Buchanan point is very simple. It's just if you have a monopoly, the monopoly is charging a high price, they're basically doing the tax for you. So if you come in and put a tax on top of that, okay, you're just generating dead weight losses because the monopoly's already reduced output to the efficient level. Okay. Okay, so that's where like the Pigouvian tax, if you can calculate the externality, if you put it on monopoly, that's not the right thing to do. Okay? You get that sort of extra dead weight loss. Okay, it would be right under competition. Okay, you get that gain, but under monopoly, introduces losses.
So it means that to incentivize the monopoly to produce the efficient one, in fact, he should be given subsidy. Right?
Depends. I mean, it depends on whether the monopoly price is above or below the price that is the competitive price plus the Pigouvian taxation. Okay. The point, I mean, in principle, it could happen. I mean, it's unlikely that he is exactly at the optimal point. If he was below, you'd want to tax him. If the monopoly were below, you'd want to tax the monopoly, but not by the optimal tax amount from the competitive market. Okay, so it's a good setup. It's worth investigating. Now the regulatory distortion here is a bit more involved than Baron-Meyerson. There's also going to be a moral hazard problem. There's adverse selection and moral hazard. Okay. Okay, so his departure. Is not just, it's not that there's a monopoly who's pricing unconstrained. It's different than the Buchanan point. Okay, what they share is that they're both not competitive situations. Okay, the Buchanan point's an unconstrained monopoly charging a high price. Okay, in Abito's world, it's that there are these asymmetric information distortions which keep you away from the competitive level. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about these public utility commissions. The same public utility commissions that were doing the water and WOLAC. But here, because he's sort of not leaning on the optimal mechanism, let's think a little bit more about what they do in practice. So for electric utilities and for natural gas, every several years there's what's called a rate case. Okay, and the rate case determines what prices can be charged for the next several years. Okay, it sort of freezes a level of prices, and then several years after there'll be another rate case that'll sort of reset those prices to some level. They're protracted affairs. Okay, several months, lots of testimony. Not very different from a merger proceeding at the DOJ. Okay, so there's different interests, and utilities trying to make money. Consumers are some consumer advocates trying to save money. The regulators trying to get the right answer, subject to other incentives. Now, I mentioned this before. One sort of main motivation for doing it based on what he observes, rather like trying to interpret the observed behavior of the regulator rather than assuming that they're doing the optimal mechanisms, that he doesn't see subsidies. So you don't see the state writing a check to the generation plant, okay, which is part of the optimal scheme. Okay, so what happens in a rate case? What they're trying to figure out is what's called this revenue requirement. Okay, this is how much money the utility needs to make to cover its operating costs and earn a fair rate of return on capital. Okay, we'll come back. That fair rate of return on capital is going to be important after lunch. Okay, so the parties debate all of these elements. So, the utilities say my costs are going to be higher. It's my borrowing costs are higher. My capital is more expensive. Okay, so that all happens. Well, one thing they do is to evaluate operating costs. They typically focus on a recent year, okay, because the idea is that costs are changing over time, so more recent years are going to be more informative. Okay, so think of there being more scrutiny on recent years, like the year before the rate case, than 3 years before. Okay, so if you've had a rate case, you have another rate case in 6 years. If you're in year 3, that's going to have less scrutiny than if you're in year 5. Okay. Okay, so Abito's point is that when there's moral hazard, so that you can control your operating costs by exerting unmeasurable effort, okay, you're going to have incentives to slack the year right before the rate case. Okay, you want to look like you have really high costs. Okay. Okay, so that when they come to determine this, they're going to see, oh, that was high last year. You've got to have high prices to cover those.
That case is like examining timely examination of
I didn't understand the question. Can you try again?
what is the rate case?
So a rate case is an administrative proceeding, okay, where the regulator who has the mandate to set the prices for the firm, they investigate what those and determine what those prices should be. Yes.
Are there unions in this market?
Yes. Yep.
So
So that would be like the line workers or the electrical plant workers. Less so now, but back then, yeah.
it could be beneficial for the firm to concede to the unions to increase their operating costs, right?
Yeah. So they're one of the parties there. I don't know if they they're not often as mentioned as present at the rate cases. There's a consumer advocate who advocates for low prices, but yeah, I don't know how that dynamic plays out exactly. But potentially there's some interesting political economy there as well. Yeah. Okay, so this is the idea that Abito's gonna rely a lot on this. So if you think like Wolak relied a lot on optimal mechanism being what's going on, Abito's going to rely a lot on this idea that the year before the firms want to shirk, okay, on their cost reducing effort.
By the way, do we see those subsidies of Baron and Meyerson in other?
I think in the French transportation they do.
Ah, they do.
Yeah,
Okay.
there the government pays the firm directly.
So that's
Yeah.
where you do see.
Yeah, and there it's also because they're sort of subsidizing their people to take the bus and stuff. The prices that the bus charge, like your bus ticket, is not the full revenue to the firm. The government also pays the firm directly. We're going to look at a paper like that next. Yeah. Mhm. But not in electricity in the U.S. Yeah. I think for some state-owned enterprises, you can also have similar dynamics there as well. Okay, so in parallel, there's this pollution stuff going on. The pollution that he's interested in is sulfur dioxide, because we're looking in the 80s. This is sort of, people weren't worrying about global warming at the time. I guess, sorry, I misspoke, 80s to 90s. So deregulation, you should think around 2000. Okay, but sulfur dioxide was a big deal. This is acid rain. Okay, that's what people worried about a lot then. And there was an acid rain program devised as part of some of the amendments to the Clean Air Act to try to reduce acid rain during this time period. Okay, so his production function is the firms are going to have two outputs. One is good, power, and one is bad, is sulfur dioxide emissions. Okay, so it's a multi-output production function. Okay, and one of the trade-offs the utility faces is that it can produce at a lower cost by using dirtier fuels. Okay, so dirtier coal has more heat content, releases more sulfur. It's cheaper for the firm. So you extract the same amount. Okay, so if you think the costs of like extracting coal, a certain amount, are the same. Some coal is dirtier but has more heat content. Okay, so you can generate more power with the same amount. Okay, so the idea is that in years right before the rate case, you're going to see firms using the cleaner, more expensive fuels, okay, to drive up their operating costs. Okay, so to formalize all this, he specifies a cost function. So this is going to be the observed cost of utility I period t. This is a productivity parameter. Okay, this is going to scale up and down all the other costs from like cost of electricity and so on. Okay, and the determination of this is where you see both the adverse selection and moral hazard. So we have the theta, that's the fixed type. Okay, it's the same notation in all the papers, theta. Okay, and then there's this effort. Okay, whereby exerting effort, you can make your type better. Okay. Okay, so by exerting effort, you make this omega smaller, okay, which reduces the costs. Okay. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in this in this output function. Okay, there's the price of a bunch of different inputs like coal and natural gas and so on. Okay, there's fixed effects for location and year and so on. Okay, but if you look, one of the outputs, so there's quantity. Remember in WOLAC, the output was quantity, so the dual cost function that would have been in the cost function here. You also have the sulfur, the pollution output, S. Okay, but more pollution is going to lower your cost. Okay. Okay, so thinking about this, the cost reducing effort, there's the firm faces a trade-off. They can exert effort which lowers their cost. Okay, but that's costly to them itself, and they might not get compensated for it because the regulator can't observe it directly. Okay, so there's some optimal choice for how much effort to exert. That's the first order, that's the optimality condition. Okay, just the marginal cost of increasing cost reducing effort equals the marginal benefit. Okay, so back to the most important assumption, or I'd say the result from the assumptions that he makes. It's actually more extreme than that they reduce their effort the period before. Under his assumptions, they go all the way to doing zero effort the period before. Okay, and what that means is the period before you basically, a high level, you see theta, because it's not theta, and there's not two unobservables, there's one which you can back out from the observed data. Okay, so it's pretty strong, but that's what sort of makes it go, is that in the period before effort zero, so you can back out the theta, and then you know the thetas, and then you can examine in the intermediate years, you can try to back out once you know theta, you can try to back out the parameters of this function.
Does it matter that there's not a k times theta? I mean, if I just put in another parameter there and say I do it relative to the year before, it's a fraction.
You're saying, is it just a normalization?
Yeah. You don't have to answer.
No, I've thought about this before. It's, yeah.
Do we really see an increase in the cost in the last year before they are?
Yeah, I'm going to show you some data that's consistent with that.
And the regulator doesn't, the regulator presumably realizes that, no?
Yeah, so the regulator might realize it. In practice, they do focus on, if you look at the documents, they do focus on the previous year. Now, whether they make any correction for it, that would be optimal. He's saying that, if you look at the documents, they really do focus on the previous. And there is a theoretical reason to focus on the previous year. If the costs are changing, the year right before is going to be.
Following these considerations, we should be suspicious of that, right? Especially if you see that there's
It changes up.
especially given that detection changes up.
Yes, it does change up. We're going to see that. We're going to, and so the question is, can't they just undo the gaming? And he's going to say they're not. They don't. Yeah.
The question is, could you estimate a Markov process for the productivity parameter from the other periods, and then the agent takes that into consideration and makes.
Yeah, look. So what we said was the difference with WOLAC. In WOLAC, he leans really hard on optimal behavior by the regulator in this sort of complex world. Okay, and I think actually you raised objections like how could you make that assumption, right? And now Abito's saying, okay, I'm not going to make that assumption. I'm going to look at what happens and I'm going to sort of condition on that. And then the objection is, well, that's not realistic because they could do something much more complex, which is...
No, it's not. But the point is that it's not so complex. The point is that I would expect the regulator to notice that there's an increase. There's a big difference between, so...
Yeah, but you don't know if that's because something real changed.
Complicated bound matters and
Yeah.
simply realizing that the firm you regulate suddenly has a higher cost in the last year.
Yeah, but they'll say something changed.
Well, does the regulator ask them to show what has changed?
Yes, but it all becomes very vague at that. It's a big discussion. Experts and...
There is a question of how hard it would be to do this one, and just see what happens.
I would
If I let
expect-
theta be a
What do you mean
first order-
exactly? Yeah.
I let theta be a first order Markov process. I estimate it maybe in not the year before, and then I assume that it's the same process and everything else is due to the
Yeah, you could.
hazard problem.
You could think about doing that. I mean, you'd probably want to look at, these regulators are only regulating 1 or 2 utilities per state. Okay, and here uncovering theta we're gonna be looking across many states. So you need each state regulator to have data on all the different utilities in different states to estimate that process. Some of these shops are very small, like the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission. Yeah. Look, let's just leave it at that. Okay, so here's the empirics. What he does is, to justify the assumption, is he regresses the log of observed cost on just whether you were in sort of a rate case year. Okay, he finds about 5% higher costs in those years. Okay, so that's the empirical support. Now, so that happens. You have the documents where they focus on that previous year. Okay, his assumption is that is sort of the opposite, is the polar opposite of Wolek. He's going to say, even though that might not be optimal, that's what I'm going to assume that they're doing. Okay, and I'm open to saying, like, okay, the truth is probably somewhere in between, from something very naive to something very complex. Okay, but it's, yeah. So think of these maybe as two poles. Okay, so he also gets a estimated distribution of theta. He gives it as a CDF. It's not comparing between asymmetric and full information. Right? He just gets one distribution. But with this distribution, you can ask, what is the optimal, how much welfare increase would there be from implementing an optimal regulatory scheme a la Barron and Meyerson? Okay, where you're also accounting for the pollution effects, not just the consumer welfare and profits. Okay.
The y-axis was frequency?
This is a CDF. One thing he plots, so he also uncovers that effort function. Okay, and these are histograms of how much it costs to reduce sulfur pollution when the firm is making 0 effort versus when the firm is making optimal effort. The axes are different. So this is 700 at the extreme. That's 1200. Okay, so he's saying they can reduce that unobserved effort can lead to lower costs of abating pollution. Okay, so two exercises. One is he calculates that fully optimal mechanism, a la Barron Meyerson. Then he says, well, that's really complicated. I'm going to try to, based on some theory work that other people have done, try to approximate that with something that's simpler. Okay, and see how much of the gains from the full can he get with the simpler mechanism. Okay, so the one issue in doing the optimal mechanism empirically is because it involves a subsidy, and you think they got to raise the funds to pay that subsidy, there's sort of an additional cost of raising public funds. Okay, which is a whole public finance literature on that, which neither he nor I nor is an expert on. So he reports that for a range. Okay, but he uses the cost of public funds at 0.3. Okay, so like raising $1 induces 30 cents requires like $1.30 of cost. He finds in that optimal mechanism he gets average welfare gains on the order of about $1 billion per year, which is a lot. Okay, this is a huge market. It's not a huge fraction of the market. Okay, but it is nothing to sneeze at. Okay, but that optimal mechanism is a pain to compute, to explain, to implement. He's going to try to find something similar. This is reminiscent of results from nonlinear pricing, okay, by Robert Wilson. Okay, whereas the optimal price nonlinear price scheme might be this function that's complicated. You can usually approximate it really well and capture most of the benefits, which is the few discrete steps. In fact, for this type of setting, Bill Rogerson proposed a simple mechanism where you just offer a menu. Okay, there's a fixed price contract and there's a full cost reimbursement contract. Okay, and Rogerson shows what's called the cutoff equilibrium, where the most efficient firms are going to choose the fixed price contract, and the least efficient firms are going to choose the cost reimbursement contract. And if you choose the parameters of those contracts right, you can capture a lot of the benefits of the fully optimal contract. Okay, so on the x-axis here is that cost of public funds. So he wants to give that range because we don't really know what the right answer is. That's our best guess from the literature, 0.3. Okay, and so at a cost of public funds of 0.3, you can capture about 70% of the gains of the fully optimal contract with a simpler menu. Okay. Okay. It's a hard paper to digest at first. It took me a while to sort of fully appreciate what's going on, but that's the basic punchline. Okay, is that there's money on the table for doing regulation better and need not be super complicated. Yes?
Just to clarify, the optimal scheme does not require any distortion.
No, it does.
Okay.
Yeah, there's still a subsidy a la Baron and Meyerson.
No, but no distortionary taxation.
No, it does because you got to pay the subsidy.
Ah.
Yeah.
Okay. So why does it come out that if social cost of public funding is 0, then you can capture the whole thing with a simpler menu?
Well, in both cases, you got to pay that cost of public funds.
Yeah.
So that doesn't really tell you. If that's 0, that doesn't tell you much about. So you're asking why is this?
Yeah.
What's the intuition for why this is decreasing the cost of public funds?
Yeah.
I get it must be something that you're making a bigger payment under the simpler scheme, but there's still a payment.
Okay. But it's strange that it's 100%. It's like
Yeah. So
makes it a perfect.
well, if you're making a bigger payment, but there's no distortionary cost when lambda is 0, right? So it doesn't really matter that you're making a bigger payment. They're both making payments, right?
Okay.
And then if the approximate thing has bigger payments, then the difference is gonna diverge as the cost of public funds. Okay, but there must be something else going on because it then flattens out. Okay. Okay, great. So we're moving to another world. Okay, different country, different sector. We're looking at bus transportation. Okay, in French cities. And think of, so they're going to look at 49 transport networks. So think of these, it's not Paris and Lyon, okay, these are smaller cities. And it's not the tiniest cities, so sort of mid-sized French cities that need to have a transportation network. The municipality doesn't run the network itself. There's a few firms who build out who run these things. And the municipality is going to contract with one of them. Okay, so they're going to say, we're going to pay you to run our bus network. They see 2 types of contract in the data. Okay, they see a cost reimbursement, so you tell us your costs, and we're going to pay you some markup on that. That's kind of like the type of regulation we saw before. And they're also going to see some municipalities which just say, here's how much we're paying you. Okay, do whatever you want. Contracts here last about 5 years on average. They don't see much switching between providers. Okay, so it's not that one firm gets replaced with another firm. They see very little of that, and they have some story for some idiosyncrasies that lead to that. It's a lot of because we're just going to let's assume that they're telling us that accurately, but they do see that some contracts switch from cost plus to fixed price. Okay, in the same municipality. They start with a cost plus and they switch to a fixed price contract. Okay, so that's in the data. You have 17 changes like that and much fewer from fixed price to cost plus. Okay, one thing they do here, which is going to come up in future papers, is they're going to, if you remember the Baron and Meyerson paper, there was this alpha. Okay, alpha was the weight that the regulator puts on consumer surplus versus firm profits. Okay, they're going to have that alpha and they're going to have it vary as a function of the partisanship of the local government. Okay, so that right-wing governments might put different weights on consumers versus firms than left-wing governments. Okay, and that's going to come up again in a later paper. Okay, so that sort of political element's also going to be going on here. Okay, so these are the regulator preferences. There is S is the surplus created by the service that the bus transportation network generates. so lambda is the cost of public funds, and they're going to be paying a subsidy to the bus transport. Okay, so they're not, I don't know if in reality these bus tickets are free. I actually spent some time in France. They weren't free, but it was pretty cheap. Okay, but that's not the ticket prices are not going to be in here. There's no price sort of regulation that's distorting this. Okay, so they're going to approximate it as just you get paid a subsidy. Okay, so there is a cost of public funds, and that's the profits of the firm. I don't know why they use U for that instead of pi, but okay. And then alpha is determines how you weight profits versus everything else. Okay, again, it's going to be similar to Abito. There's going to be moral hazard and adverse selection. Okay, same functional form. Okay, so the firm's payoffs are how much they get from the municipality minus their cost, which is determined as a function of their fixed type and how much effort they do. Okay, and then this is their effort cost function. Okay, so the regulator doesn't know theta and can't condition on E in its contract. Okay, they're going to think about a multi-period model. Okay, actually a two-period model. So I'm going to call two-period models static for our purposes here. So what they do is they derive the optimal commitment contract. That is, at time 0, I'm going to tell you what your incentive schemes are for both periods, and I'm not going to change. Okay, so without commitment, it could be that I offer you time period 1. Okay, then I learn something about, based on what you chose and what you did, I learned something about your theta, then I switch it in period 2. Okay, that would be a form of no commitment. That's going to hamper what the firm, you can always do with commitment what you could do without commitment. Okay, so that's going to be a constraint on the regulator. Theoretically, what they find is that the full commitment optimal menu is a fixed price contract in both periods. They don't see that in the data, right? They see some switching of contract type from cost plus to fixed price. Okay, so they're going to say that commitment's not what's going on in the data. In the data, there's a commitment problem. Okay, because if there weren't, we'd see just fixed price every period, no switching. Okay, this commitment, it's a bit different than, so when I talked about commitment initially, I was talking about ex pros appropriation of capital investments. Here there's no capital investment. Okay, here it's called the ratchet effect. It's using information that you reveal against you. Okay, so it's a slightly different notion of commitment than what I talked about originally. Okay, so that's actually just saying the same thing. Okay, so they're a bit more similar to Abito than to Wolak. Okay, because the Wolak philosophy would be the optimal thing is to offer fixed price contracts both periods, so I'm going to assume that's what they're doing. Okay, but that's not a tenable assumption because we see the other types of contracts in the switching. Okay, so they're going to say, let's condition on there not being full commitment, theoretically optimal, and let's do what would be the optimal menu of two-period contracts under no commitment. Okay, and they're going to look for renegotiation-proof schedules of two-period contracts. And so their interpretation of the regulatory process is that the regulators offer a menu of two-period contracts. One choice on the menu says you can have fixed price both periods. The next choice on the menu says you can start with a cost plus and then switch to a fixed price. And the third choice on the menu says you can have cost plus in both periods. Okay.
Why not pay for it?
So two things. One is they hardly see it in the data. It only happens 3 times. And I think it's not optimal to have something like that here. There's no one would want to use it. Yeah. So it might be without loss of generality as well. It's similar to the Rogerson thing. So they show the existence of a cutoff equilibrium. Okay, so if you have a really good theta, a really efficient firm, you're going to choose both periods fixed price. Okay, there's an intermediate range where you choose this, so you start off cost plus and then switch. Okay, and the inefficient firms are going to choose the cost plus in both periods. Okay, so there's a whole theoretical part where they show that cutoff equilibrium. Yes?
Another mechanism substitute to the fixed price cost plus to signal that you're making an effort so that you will not be hurt by making the effort.
Yeah, so these are,
Not here. Here, no. I mean,
no, these are renegotiate, it is actually relevant here. These are renegotiation proof. Okay, so
I mean another mechanism like signaling, which is not.
I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. Maybe, so there is an aspect of that the information here could get used against them, but everyone understands that, so you can sort of restrict attention to renegotiation proof contracts. Okay, more than that we'll take offline, yeah.
In each municipality, there can be many operators or just one operator?
One, yeah, you're sort of, it's a natural monopoly setting. You just want one guy to make sure everything's in sync and so on, yeah.
And you don't want to change operators?
So in principle, you might like to change operators. They don't see it happening, okay? And there's this whole section of something idiosyncratic to France and stuff so they're not going to deal with that. I don't know how to evaluate those because you have
I
to.
think that all these models miss the political economy aspect of the story. To what extent is the regulator captured by the regulator? To what extent is he independent? What is the balance of power
Yeah, I don't think
between
that's.
regulator and regulated? In the real life, that makes a difference.
Yeah, but I don't think it's fair to say this model misses that because they have this alpha, and they're going to make this alpha a function of the partisanship of the local politics. Okay, so I think for the other papers that there was an aspect of you're missing the political economy, but I don't think that's a fair criticism for this paper. Now, whether this captures all the political economy, that's another thing, but this would let you have a captured regulator, right? Because it could put alpha really high. Yes?
I think I'm missing something. If using this scheme you can identify the less effective firms, then why not, after the 2 periods are over, fire them?
Yeah, in this world, it's only 2 periods.
Yeah.
Okay, so that you're talking about a
Yeah,
longer
but
model.
No, I'm talking about in the real world, in the estimation.
Yeah, so a period here is 5 years. They're saying lots of stuff changes over 5 years. They're thinking about this as the repeated thing. They're modeling just as a 2-period model. Yeah. Yeah. There's all these trade-offs you have to make when you're trying to do it empirically. Sorry, I'm skipping around here. Let me just get back to where we were.
But it's odd that in the city, bus rates are well known. So if in one city it's one bus rate, in the other city it's a different bus rate, there should be questions.
Yeah, but every city has got different roads, weather. No? Shaking your head no. I'm willing to bet on that one.
I don't think that you can convince the public in Lyon that they are paying twice or 40% higher bus rate than in Grenoble because of weather or something.
I don't.
And the regulator in Lyon will have to explain how comes that the Grenoble people are paying a lower bus rate.
I agree. You can't do it to like unconstrained. There's constraints placed on benchmarking against other cities, but there can be differences in cities. Yeah. I think you should be a little bit more open-minded about that. Yeah. Okay, so here's the data. Remember, it's just 49 cities. So that's how much they're getting paid by the cities. You get there is large variance in the size of the network. Okay, number of vehicles. Okay, labor cost, engineers, the municipal government, so on. These are the main operators down here. Okay, so it's just telling you. Okay, so they make a parametric distribution on the thetas. Okay, they assume that the thetas are normally distributed again, I'm not going to get into the details of the estimation, okay, which are non-trivial. But they estimate those parameters of that normal distribution and effort cost parameters by maximum likelihood. There's going to be no unobserved heterogeneity across municipalities, okay, but there is observed heterogeneity. Okay, you don't even want observed heterogeneity. And then finally, given the estimated distribution of types and subsidies, they can back out alpha, okay, as a function of the different partisanships. Okay, so it's sort of a multi-stage process. So one step is getting the production technology, and the next step is thinking about the regulator's preferences. Okay, so what they do is their counterfactual is what if there was full commitment? Okay, that's their benchmark. Okay, and what they find is that, to summarize, is that full commitment would increase welfare, but most of the gains would accrue to the bus operator, the firm. Okay, so moving to full commitment might be politically not obvious, even though it raises total welfare. Okay.
Appoints the regulator.
Regulator is elected. It's the city government, so it'd be the mayor. Yeah.
So he's worried about pricing.
Mhm. Yeah. Probably very acute for the voters. Yeah. That's in this one. In the other ones, those were bureaucrats appointed by the state governor in the electricity ones. Yeah. Okay. Yes. Sorry.
How do the firms feel about the thing that national monopolists, some sort of procurement process or anything like that make a firm a national monopolist?
Yeah. So we said so the question is how do you get stuck with one firm? The truth is I'm not 100% sure. Presumably there was some franchising auction sometime, and maybe these firms started off as regional firms that led to. It's a good question. I don't know the detail.
There's sort of the political economy aspect, right? Like a lot of literature, like first trying to get the system with which they get chosen as national monopolies. That could be another dimension.
I think that's an interesting dimension. Is how's that initial franchising decided? Okay, it's not under analysis here. I don't know a hell of a lot about it for the French case. Yeah, I know a little bit about the cable. This was an issue in cable in the U.S. How they did that, and usually it was a bidding process, and you try to give the government stuff, and whoever gave the government the best deal. Yeah. Okay, so you can sort of see the style of papers. You write down the model of the firm's technology. You make some assumptions on the regulatory process, whether it's like some optimal mechanism or try to sort of calibrate it to what you see in practice, estimate parameters, then some counterfactual of how can we do this better. Okay. So in the last bit here, we're going to switch industries again. And we're actually going to get out of the asymmetric information world. Okay. We're going to look at healthcare, in particular, the administration and manufacturing of drugs in the US. And these are drugs that are administered at the doctor's office. Okay, so not the tablets you take at home, okay, but like chemotherapy, the anesthesia before surgery, okay, at the hospital or at the doctor's office. Okay. Now, one thing that's been going on in the US, which is kind of weird when you think about it, you sort of ask yourself what's going on, is okay, so there are reported shortages in drugs. Okay, that's not that weird because these drugs, because they go into your bloodstream, they're produced under a really highly controlled production process. You can't have any contamination. You know, like the analogy people make is you can swallow a pill with dirt on it, but you can't inject a medicine with dirt in it into your body. Okay, one's okay, one's not okay. So they're highly controlled, and plants get shut down because there's some contamination that gets found. Okay, so you can't stop everything. You're going to get some shortage. A shortage here is when enough people call there's an industry association called the American Society of Health Pharmacists. Okay, these are the pharmacists who work at the hospitals and doctors' offices. Okay, if they call their drug suppliers and they make an order, and the drug supplier says we don't have any, they report that to the ASHP. ASHP has some criterion where there's enough of those reports, they say, okay, this drug's in shortage. Okay. So this is a bar graph of shortages by year. Okay, and you can see an increase after 2005, 2006. Okay. Shortages go up. And this is the number of new reported shortages. Some of these shortages last longer than others. Okay, so they sort of went up in reports and they sort of stayed elevated here. Okay, but some of these drugs that went on shortage here could still be not counted in this number because they're still on shortage, but they're not a new report. Okay, and these are very, if there's no problem in the production process, these are very cheap drugs to make, and they usually, a lot of them cost very little to buy as well. I think 50 cents, $1 for a dose. Okay, this is recent data already into 2018. Okay, so I wrote a paper on this, which I'm going to talk about, where we stopped here. Okay, so our data, this is data from, I thought I cut all these. I did a find and replace for ECTA to ECMA for the
Should be injectables, right?
injectables, yeah. So it's this word, injectables. Okay, so you can split this into, this is now going to be days, so this isn't about new, this is just like how many drugs are in shortage. So a unit here is a drug day. Okay, we go through 2012. And you can split this into which of these are sterile injectables. These are drugs that are administered through the bloodstream versus other. That could be topical, tablet, whatever. Okay, so most of the increase is in, at least the increase was much larger for sterile injectables. And you can see that the levels are higher for sterile injectables as well. Okay, so the question is, what's going on? Can we do anything about it? Is it good? Is it bad? What's going on? Okay, so here's the supply chain, rough. Okay, so we're patients. Let's say we have cancer. We go to the doctor's office. We get our cancer treatment. Okay, so that's the provider administers us the drug. We make a small payment to the provider, copay or whatever. Okay, but most of our money is being paid in premiums to the insurer who pays the provider. Okay, and a huge insurer is Medicare. Okay, largest insurer by far. Okay, and the provider is responsible for procuring the medicine, okay, from the manufacturer. Okay, now there's additional chains here. There's a wholesaler and stuff. Okay, but roughly there's. Okay, so that's like a normal market. There could be bargaining there and so on. Okay, and this is a little bit more.
When there is shortage, it means that, say, the medical procedure is delayed or there is a substitute done?
It depends on what's under shortage. It could be that.
Because those may have different effects.
Yes, very different. I mean, so
And
the substitutes typically.
Should we split your data along this line? Because what's going to go on is very different in the two cases.
Yeah, so it would be nice if I could do that. It requires a lot of information on different diseases and what the substitutes are. We see examples of both from anecdotes, okay, where they use a medication that's a substitute, but it's obviously not what they wanted to use to begin with, so it should be a little bit worse. In some cases where they delay treatment, hoping for the drug to come back offline. We're not going to be able to analyze those differences. Okay, yeah, so shortage here is they call up, make an order, and they don't have it. Okay, so they report to the ASHP, who, if they get enough of those reports, then we got a shortage. Okay, so now the idea in this paper is, what we're going to talk about is Medicare changed how it pays providers, okay, for these drugs. Okay, and they change it in a way that's it becomes less attractive to be a provider administering these drugs. Okay, and then in a bargaining framework, that's like reducing the size of the pie here to be chopped up between the manufacturer and the provider. Okay, so if there's some, as long as the provider is not getting all of the gains from trade, okay, reducing the size of the pie is going to make it less attractive to be a manufacturer. Okay, now think about the manufacturer. One of their decisions is, how clean should I keep my facility, or how much backup production should I have? Okay. You know, I could have somebody monitoring, scrubbing with the toothbrush, everything, and never get a shortage. Okay, but that's going to be costly. Okay, so the idea is that like when this pie shrinks, those investments shrink because it's less attractive to make those investments. Okay, so that's what we're going to try to show in the data. Okay, so under our definition, Medicare reimbursement's a form of regulation. Okay, they're effectively the buyers in this market, but they also basically set the price. I know many people aren't from the U.S. Okay, so Medicare, I was confused about this for a long time. There's Part A, Part B, okay, and Part C and D as well. Okay, Part B is when you go to the doctor's office. Okay, Part A is when you go to the hospital. Actually, Part B is when you go to the doctor's office or an outpatient procedure at the hospital. That is, you don't stay overnight. Okay, so that's Part B. That's what we're looking at. Okay, and Part D is the drugs you get at the pharmacy, like at the tablets you get at the pharmacy. Okay, so for Part B, until 2005, reimbursement was written as a rule that was based on a list price called the average wholesale price, AWP. Okay, this was literally a price that was listed in some book, okay, that had no bearing to anything. You could put whatever number you wanted there. Okay, the only constraint on it is that if you put too high a number, you might get pushback but it's very informal. Okay, so there's lots of games being played here, and they would sort of reduce what fraction of the AWP they're changing over time to try to deal with that. But you had many cases, I would say, okay, like more than 10, where the AWP would bear zero resemblance to the actual transaction price. Okay, it could be off by 800%, 1200%. Okay, so they looked at that and they're like, there was actually a joke that this stands for ain't what's paid. Okay. So Medicare looked at that. They were doing Medicare Part D at the same time. The Congress was doing Medicare Part D. And as part of that legislation, which took place in 2005, they tried to fix this. Okay, they said, that doesn't make any sense. We're going to pay, you're going to report how much you paid for the drugs last quarter. Okay, then next quarter we're going to pay you whatever that was plus 6%. Okay. Now, the effect of that on how much money was being paid for the drugs is that the payments, the reimbursements went down. Okay, these are by, so this is the median price drug. Okay, you can see around 2005 these payments start to go down. Legislation was passed in 2003, took place in 2005. Okay, so there's a sort of a question of when the exact break is. Okay, but there you can see them going down. The really cheap ones went down too, and you can see that the expensive ones as well. Okay, so you see that drop in the payments being made in right around 2005. Okay, this is from Medicare to doctor. Okay, then there's another level which is doctor to manufacturer. Yes?
Are there any other customers for these medicines?
Yes. So people who, you mean non-Medicare customers?
Yeah, so
Yeah, Medicare is not for everybody. It's only for old people. That's good.
I mean, there is a market price on the drugs, so they're not exclusively used in this program.
Okay, so if we go back here, I'm not sure I'm fully appreciating what you're trying to get at. There are providers who serve non-Medicare patients who also buy the drugs.
And they pay market price.
Well, these providers, you have a doctor's office. Some patients are Medicare, some patients aren't Medicare. But when I buy my drug, I order a batch of drugs. I'm not saying one batch for my Medicare, one batch for my non-Medicare. Right? There's a market here. That is the market price. Mm-hmm. Now, different insurers might reimburse differently than Medicare. In fact, they typically reimburse a bit more than Medicare. So
reimbursement is not exactly the price paid.
So under the new scheme, the reimbursement by Medicare was the price paid last quarter plus 6%.
Price paid by providers to manufacturers.
Yes. So every provider sends in, sorry, actually it's done through the manufacturers all report their income by drug. Okay, then Medicare. Yeah. Okay, so what? It's a pretty simple story. The pie shrunk. Right? It became less attractive to make and administer these drugs. Here you can look at. So we index revenue. We didn't have data. So these are non-Medicare data. We don't have that going back before 2003. We have some Medicare data going back before 2003. Okay, but revenue from Medicare sort of flattened out. Okay, right around that. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to build a simple theoretical model of this, get some comparative statics, and then run some regressions to try to test that model. Okay, and this story of like it's less attractive to make drugs, so we invest less. To economists, it's very natural. Okay, a lot of pushback from medical community. Okay, they're like, that's not what's going on. It's not about that. We don't care about all types of stuff. Okay, so what we're trying to show here is like there is some supply elasticity, basically. Okay, so it's like a pretty low bar, I think, to meet, but still worth getting over. Okay, so let's get into that model in the last few minutes here, and then I'll show you the regression. Make sure. Okay. Okay, so think of a single disease, single drug formulation. There's a massive consumer, size M. Okay, they're all willing to pay up to some choke price, Pmax, for that medicine. Okay, of that size, of that mass M, some fraction MGov are insured by Medicare. Okay, so that's basically the demand system. There's a bunch of drug manufacturers who can enter the market and produce. Okay, so they decide whether I want to produce this drug by paying some cost of entry, and then they choose how much capacity to invest in. Okay, which we're going to call KI. So that's the capacity choice of the ith firm, okay, which is costly. Once capacity is chosen, then there's going to be a shock which hits each firm. Okay, and that shock is going to scale down the actual capacity that they can produce for the market. Okay, so they choose a capacity of 10. Okay, shocks come in. Some plants don't get scaled down at all. Nothing happened. Okay, some plants can only produce 5 because, some animal got into their factory or something. Okay, that's one of the things that happens. Yeah. Okay, it's usually some type of contamination, either from an animal or some other liquid, or different medicines get mixed with each other. Okay, now the way we model the reimbursement under ASP, that's the cost base. That's what they switch to. Okay, we're going to model this as a very extreme market mechanism. That is, if the total capacity in the market after the shocks exceeds the demand, okay, then the price falls to 0 because there's excess supply. Okay, you've already built your capacity. There's no marginal cost above that. Okay, so the price falls to 0. This is a very stark model of pricing. Okay, but if there's not enough capacity in the market, you get the choke price. Okay, it's like the monopoly price. Yes. Oh, okay, storage. You'd think that shortages would be less of they're not very storable. Okay, because they're heat sensitive, light sensitive. It's expensive to store them. Yeah, that's a good point I should have mentioned. Okay, this market actually, it has a lot in common with electricity, is that you need to match supply and demand sort of at fine time intervals. And capacity is costly, and there's shocks to supply. You can also think about shocks to demand, but I think that's less of an issue for these drugs. Okay, now under the previous regime, the ain't what's paid regime, it's different. Okay, so if there's a shortage, you still get the monopoly price. Okay, but in the world where the capacity exceeds the demand, you still get paid a little bit from Medicare, right? Because Medicare is sort of paying you based off this list price. Okay, we're going to say a fraction gamma of that, that's like a bargaining parameter, goes to the manufacturer. Okay, so as long as gamma is not 0, it's going to be more attractive to be a manufacturer in this regime than in the other regime. Okay, because here you get paid sometimes even when there's plenty of capacity in the market. Okay, so here's just some simulations from the model. This on the y-axis in each of these is the shortage frequency, how often you get a shortage. That is when you're in this world. Okay, as a function of the choke price. So if the drug has higher demand, you're going to get less shortages. And as a function of market size. So market size is interesting because for a given number of firms, as the market gets bigger, you're more likely to get a shortage, right? Because there's more people who want the medicine. But if the market, if it goes up, then a new firm comes in. Okay, so that's why you get that sort of zigzag pattern. Okay, and then here this is conditional on, so this is under, the solid line is under cost-based reimbursement, and the dashed line is under the what's paid reimbursement. Okay, so shortages are lower in the dashed line, right? Because that's the more attractive one to be in. So here, this is the main thing we use for the empirical analysis. So this is based on what fraction of the patients are Medicare patients. Okay, so you see that divergence of the two lines. So in the ASP, it doesn't matter what fraction are Medicare patients. Okay, but it does matter for the AWP. Okay, for AWP, the more Medicare patients they are, the less shortages you're going to have, right? Because it's attractive to be paid by the government under AWP. And this is going to be the main comparative static. Okay, so the idea of the empirical analysis is that we're going to look at a bunch of different medicines. Okay, different medicines target different diseases, and different diseases hit different age groups. Okay, Medicare insures people 65 and over. Okay, so if you're a drug serving a disease which hits old people, you're going to be more affected by the change in policy. Okay, whereas if you're a drug which serves diseases for like toddlers, okay, then Medicare can change what it's doing. It doesn't matter because none of my patients are reimbursed by Medicare anyway. Okay, so that's okay, so we should see that when you switch from here to here, that drugs which are here have less increase in shortages than drugs which are here. Yes, please.
On the face of it, Medicare was paying the average price, wasn't it? What was the new rule of Medicare? That it's paying the price.
No, that's the whole point. Is so prior to the change, they were paying this sort of ambiguously determined list price, which had no statutory requirement to correspond to anything. There was sort of informal threat of regulation and so on.
And afterwards?
And afterwards, they were paying the actual price.
But usually when you pay the actual price, and the price is cost-based, you should get shortages. Why?
Okay, I think I get the subtext here. So the shortages are not, it's not, the fact that shortages go up is not necessarily a bad thing, right? We want to tolerate some shortages, and it's not clear that we want fewer or more shortages, okay? What we're trying to say here is that, apologies for skipping around, okay, this happened, shortages went up, okay, Medicare changed its policies here, okay? We want to say, can we attribute this to that change? We're not saying necessarily that this is worse than that. A lot of people think this is worse than that. Okay, I think this is worse than that. We don't have the demand. It actually comes back to the question here about substitutes and so on. We can't conclusively show that. Okay, but our goal is not to say that this is worse than that. I mean, that's not what we can do in this paper. Our goal is to say that we can attribute some of this increase to that change.
Are these plants producing only one type of drug, or are they producing?
No, so you should think of it as like there's a bunch of vats, big vats where this stuff gets mixed, and like the pipes, and then you can at one point a vat is producing one drug, and that might last for months or weeks or years, and it takes like a day or two to clean it out and switch it to something else.
So they might be switching to non-Medicare drugs, right?
They could be switching to non-Medicare drugs. And one more thing is to be able to switch your vat to making the other drug, you have to have a authorization from the FDA. It's not that every plant at every moment can start producing every drug. And you got to source the raw ingredients and so on too. So, yeah.
The fact that it's based on last year's sale price, does this induce ultimately a ratchet sort of?
Yeah, there's some interesting, so it's not the price so in the model we do it as the price this period.
I see.
In reality, it's like the price actually 2 quarters before. And that does introduce some cases where a firm could be underwater ordering its drugs. So there's some dynamics there that we don't deal with here.
Is it sufficient large number of firms so that you can rule out that just a way for the firms to try and change the Medicare rule, roll it back?
Okay, so the question is, are these firms responding to the regulation by increasing shortages as a tactic to have them go back to what they liked before? I can't rule that out. I mean, that's pretty devious behavior. I wouldn't put it. I don't know. I mean, well, we can show. I mean, in
These
the
are pharmaceutical companies,
Mhm.
so
They're in the it's pharmaceutical
that's part of the game.
yeah, I mean, there's levels to, that type of behavior. Our stand is that they're going to be just trying to make money in sort of the market without sort of these maneuvers to try to change the regulation. Okay, and that's enough to generate an increase in shortages. We can't actually explain all of the increase, but there's other stuff changing at the same time. Okay, so where are we? Okay, so it's really, the empirics really sort of turn on that. Some drugs are for diseases which Medicare is sort of those diseases are highly exposed to Medicare patients. Okay, and some aren't. Okay, so the regressions are basically diff and diffs. Okay, so I'll show you those. Let me skip the descriptive statistics, though. Let me mention one differentiation we'll make is off-patent versus on-patent. Okay, so for drugs that are on-patent, there's only one firm producing them. They're not going to be sort of subject to this. Okay, because they can charge the monopoly price all the time. Okay, so we shouldn't see much shortages in the on-patent drugs. Okay, so the first regression, so on the left-hand side is the number of shortage days. We're going to have drug fixed effects, year fixed effects, okay? And then we're going to interact this post period that's after, so that's 2005 and after, with the Medicare market share of drug I. Okay, that is how exposed is the drug to, so if all your patients are Medicare patients, that's 1. Okay, if none of them are Medicare patients, that's 0. Okay, and we also have a dummy because some of these drugs switch to off-patent during the period. Okay, so there's some within drug variation in whether you're off-patent or on-patent. Okay, so that's the coefficient of interest. Now, one thing, we get these Medicare market shares from samples of patients, and they're measured with some error. Okay, they're not even totally random samples, unfortunately. But so we actually have 2 different samples, and we do some IV, some of the specifications to try to reduce that measurement error. But even without the IV, you can see an increase in the number of shortage days for the drugs which are more exposed to Medicare after the change in policy. Okay, so in a diff and diff, what do you worry about? You worry that there's some pre-existing trend, okay, that those drugs were experiencing different changes and shortages prior to the policy. Okay, so for that, we interact year with the Medicare market share, okay, and we don't see any, so we don't have that many pre-period years, okay, but we don't see any evidence of a pre-existing trend. One thing that's kind of interesting, it takes a little while for the shortages to really scale up. This table is broken in half, so this is a continuation of there. Okay, so it really sort of hits a peak a few years after the change. Okay, so that's something we got pushed back on as well, as like why does it take 4 or 5 years? We don't have a great answer. Yeah.
Did this change affect the physician's incentive to prescribe the drug? Like the payment system might be a complicated change.
Yeah, it changed. I mean, it directly changed how much the physician's getting paid for drugs.
Right. So what if there's an increase in demand by the physician to because the administration fee is higher for that?
So here it made it less attractive.
They made it even less attractive,
Yeah.
even for the physician.
Yeah. No, it's less attractive for the physician. Our claim is that it also, by making it less attractive for the physician, it's also less attractive for the manufacturer. That part's actually a little vaguer. Yeah. I think there was a hand here, then we'll go. Yeah, go ahead. So what we want to, so here, in a world where there's no effect of the policy change, you could see this type of correlation where there's some trend in these drugs that were just the drugs that treated older people were having higher increase in shortages prior. Okay, you would generate a correlation like this, and then you'd be, if that was going on, you'd be misattributing it to the policy change. Okay, so what we look is, in those drugs, do we see any difference in the shortages in the years before? If anything, they were a bit lower. Yes?
So you have, over time, two trends. You have increasing demand because bigger population and maybe also older population, and also you have depreciation of the production capital. So if you, at some point, decrease investment, it will take time for this to kick in.
Yeah, I agree. That's my story too, is that these changes in like how much the systems you have for preventing shortages take a few years to kick in. It's like even if you stop taking care of your plant, doesn't mean you're going to get a contamination the next day. Yeah, yeah, I'm with you. Like, oh, I'm over time. Okay, I'm keeping us from lunch. So the only point here is that you only see it for the off-patent drugs, okay, as it should be. Okay, so this was a two-period investment model. After lunch, we're going to talk about some fully dynamic investment models. So let's go eat and then come back.